The current trajectory is that both America and the West as a whole is going to have a much larger mix of non-Christian religions and also a larger mix of people who don't trace their ethnicity to European roots. The question we might ask is just how much friction does it have to produce? Does that mean that there has to be tremendous amounts of tension or difficulties with the rest of the country? What does this mean for conservatives and conservatism? At the end of September, the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, which is the publisher of Modern Age, held its big homecoming event at its wonderful, beautiful headquarters in Wilmington, Delaware. And this event actually brought together a roundtable of a number of conservative intellectuals, not only from the United States, but also from Europe. It included a number of British thinkers, such as Philip Blond and Mary Harrington, as well as certain Americans who've been based in Europe in recent years, such as my friend Rod Dreher. Now, this event prompted a great deal of conversation afterwards about what is happening to Europe as a whole, what's happening in terms of demographics as well as politics. And an interesting fact came to my attention, namely that in the city of Vienna, the capital of Austria, 40%, or in fact 41% of school-age children are now Muslim. Now, this is not something that's just a tremendous change that's coming to Austria and to Vienna in particular. You also see similar demographic shifts taking place in other cities throughout Europe. London itself, for example, seems to have about 33% of its school-age children are Muslim. Now, if you look at the overall proportion of Muslims in the UK or in many other parts of Europe, you'll often see that while it is a growing percentage, it's still a fairly small percent. We're talking about, maybe 10% or so, not something that looks like any kind of majority. But you have to think not only in terms of the raw numbers today, but also in terms of what the demographic pyramid looks like. And in fact, many older Austrians, older Englishmen, they are not at an age where they're going to have any more children. Whereas if you look at the younger generation, if you look at Generation Z and Generation Alpha, you'll find out that there are much more dramatic demographic changes. You also have to look at different segments of a country. So if you look at the large cities, places like Vienna and London, you'll see that the change there is much greater than the change in the countryside. So you're heading towards a condition where Europe may have a number of great cities which have a very different kind of religious affiliation, or a plurality, in fact, perhaps even of Muslims, within the capital cities of Austria or the UK, whereas you have a very different religious makeup in other parts of the country, a more historic, Christian composition of the British population or of the Austrian population. Now, this got me thinking about some long-term trends in both America and the UK in particular, so in the English-speaking world. In the year 2012, for example, America for the first time ceased to have a Protestant majority. America to this day still has a Christian majority, but it's a different kind of Christian majority than it's had in the past. So America had been founded with a majority Protestant population. It had always thought of itself as a Protestant country, but demographically speaking, that's no longer the case. Protestants are now no longer the majority of the country. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age. You can find Modern Age online at modernAgeJournal.com. We have brilliant articles from the best conservative thinkers every weekday. We also are in print as a quarterly journal founded all the way back in 1957 by the great Russell Kirk, the author of The Conservative Mind. If you want to see not only Kirkian ideas, but the best ideas on the American right, the most carefully thought through ideas on the right, please subscribe to Modern Age. Visit Modern Age's website, modernAgeJournal.com. And of course, follow us on YouTube, follow us on Twitter, and throughout social media. Now, more recently, Britain has had an even more dramatic change. So in Britain, as of 2021, according to the census that year, Britain no longer has a Christian majority at all. This is, the first time in well over 1,500 years. You can't say quite 2,000 years, but it's somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 years that Britain has not had a Christian majority. This is an epochal change within Britain. Now, both in the United States and in Britain, What's driving a lot of this change isn't the growth of other religions, it's actually just the decay of Christianity itself. The fact that you have more and more people who do not affiliate with any church who are now designated as nones, N-O-N-E-S, meaning that they don't have a religious identity of any kind. Maybe their forefathers might have been Christians of one denomination or another. They might have been Protestant or Catholic. But now you have a generation which doesn't identify with any faith. Now, there are some indications that this trend may have peaked, that in fact the growth in this category of so-called nones may have reached its zenith, and perhaps now you are seeing either a stabilization of religious affiliation or perhaps even some signs of growth. Both Catholics but also various Protestant denominations see some encouraging signs that in fact there will be a reemergence of Catholic faith or Protestant faith within the United States, perhaps even in some place like the UK and in parts of Europe. That said, the overall trend of the population as a whole is that you have a tendency towards disaffiliation with Christianity, combined with relatively small proportions of non-Christian immigrant communities and communities that are of relatively recent arrival within Europe or within the United States, communities where you have non-Christian religions that are increasingly growing. Now think about how in November, you're going to have an election for mayor of New York City, where the leading candidate is the Democratic nominee, Zohran Mamdani. Zohran Mamdani is both a self-identified socialist of a sort and also is Muslim. If you think about the other great city, in fact, London and New York City are the two biggest cities in the English-speaking world. Well, London also has a Muslim mayor who is from a left-wing party, that is Sadiq Khan. So we're not talking about a future where you will have a kind of post-Christian or post-European, demography in a place like London or perhaps a place like New York. The future is already here. You already have a tremendous change in both the religious and the ethnic complexions of both London and New York, and more broadly, more slowly, but nonetheless, taking place over the course of generations, more broadly changes in the whole of countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, and also changes within continental Europe. Now, obviously, this is going to produce certain kinds of political friction, although the question we might ask is just how much friction does it have to produce? Does it have to be the case that simply because you have religious pluralities that are quite different in places like London or perhaps in the future in Vienna, does that mean that there has to be tremendous amounts of tension or difficulties with the rest of the country? Or, as the more optimistic persons would say, will this simply be kind of like some of the tensions that used to exist even in the early part of the 20th century between, say, Catholics and Protestants? There used to be a great deal of hostility, a great deal of animosity, even between Catholics and Protestants in the early part of the 20th century. And obviously, if you go back even further in European history, you have a great deal of direct conflict between Catholics and Protestants. So it may be that simply having religious diversity, it's a different kind of diversity now, but perhaps it's not something that is fundamentally different from the religious diversity that existed in the past among Christian groups. This is a hypothesis that remains to be tested, and obviously history right now is moving in a direction of giving that hypothesis a very practical test. Now, in thinking about what it means to have a different religion, perhaps also different ethnic demographics in a country which has traditionally, had either a European ethnic basis and a Christian religion, the question that needs to be asked is, what does this mean for conservatives and conservatism? Now, conservatism in America in the past century or so has generally taken a very ecumenical approach to how it deals with questions, certainly of ethnicity, but even of religion. So while the Christian religion is extremely important to American conservatives as a whole, it has been a very latitudinarian view of Christianity, which has tended to prevail on the right. So even though there are, Catholic conservatives who believe very strongly in the need to make America a fully Catholic country, and there are Calvinist and other Protestant conservatives who believe that America should return to its Puritan roots and should be a thoroughgoing Protestant country, In practice, the conservative movement as a whole has been rather more ecumenical than that. It has been, in fact, a combination of different religious denominations. Now, this is even extended to the point where, over the decades, conservatism tends to have kind of shifting goalposts about what it sees as being the essential religious anchor of the United States. So there was a time, about 100 years ago, when it was still quite conventional to talk about America as a Protestant country and to say that our political institutions have Protestant roots. And Alexis de Tocqueville himself, by the way, in Democracy in America, makes this point in his great 19th century text. He says that the reason why America has the kind of democracy, the kind of community self-responsibility that it possesses is because of this legacy of Puritanism. Now, many later critics have said, well, perhaps Tocqueville exaggerated that. Perhaps Tocqueville, spent too much time in New England. He didn't give enough thought to other parts of the country, and in particular the South. However, it is worth noting that even the less puritanical versions of Christianity and denominations of Protestantism that prevailed in the American South in the 18th and then the 19th century, even those did have a relatively Protestant character by the standards of continental Europe. So they were much more sort of community organized and low church oriented, to use the parlance of British Anglicanism, for example. They were much more low church than the Anglican Church in the UK itself, in England, and obviously they were much more so than the Catholic Church on the European continent. So one question is the change in religion in America away from a Protestant majority and away from these traditions that Tocqueville thought were essential to the political structure of America, does that mean that America is now going to have a different kind of politics as well as a different kind of religious makeup? Now, Tocqueville himself makes a prophecy, and it's a prophecy that often gets quoted partly, but not in full, by American Catholics, because Tocqueville thought that Catholicism was actually in a tremendous position to gain converts in America. So already in the early 19th century, Alexis de Tocqueville said Catholicism might very well be the wave of the future in America in terms of gaining converts from Protestantism. However, the other part of Tocqueville's prediction, the one that American Catholics today tend not to put so much emphasis on, has also turned out to be relatively true. This was a prediction that Tocqueville made where he said that just as many Protestants will be attracted to Catholicism in America, you will have American Catholics start to drift away from the church and to lose their sense of Catholic affiliation. And if you look at cradle Catholics in America, you look at the relatively low rates of church attendance, the relatively low rates of belief in some of the core tenets of the church, whether it's social teachings, whether it's teachings about contraception, or whether it's teachings about theology, about the nature of the Godhead, the nature of the Trinity. American Catholics, often are only vaguely Catholic, and then over time, American Catholics, just like Protestants, are often joining this category of so-called nuns, not affiliated with any religion. So Tocqueville has already made a prediction which has partly come true, perhaps, and it's a prediction that has some signs of hope for Roman Catholics in America, but also certain signs that are very troubling. There, are often seem to be political implications of the religious character of a country. There are also, of course, conservatives point to the importance of history in determining a nation's character and its political habits and its political institutions. And so if you have a sudden break with that history, perhaps a break with its traditional religion or a break with a country's, historic ethnic majority, that you would therefore have also a change in its politics following from that. This is something that's of great concern to conservatives. When conservatives in the 20th century have talked about what it means to be an American and what it means to conserve America's traditions, as I say, there has been a tendency over time to shift that definition. So at one time in the early 20th century, the emphasis was on America as a Protestant country with Protestant institutions. Then, by the mid-20th century and in the immediate aftermath of World War II, there was an increasing emphasis on the idea that America was a country really with a tripartite religious tradition, and that it included Protestants, but also Catholics and Jews. And then, of course, by the late 20th century and into the 21st century, a term that was commonly heard in conservative circles was that America had Judeo-Christian values and a Judeo-Christian tradition to be preserved. This was obviously a way of highlighting that, yes, America has historically a very strong Christian majority, but that Christian majority is very capacious, and that includes not just Protestants, it also includes Catholics. And in fact, it is so capacious that it includes as well non-Christians, such as Jews, who are also, of course, they have the Old Testament, and they have, a great deal in common as an Abrahamic faith, as a faith, that also traces a lineage to Moses. The Jews have a great deal in common with Christians. And in America in particular, that's always been the case. And there always has been a good deal of both philo-Semitism among American Christians, and also a strong, successful integration of American Jews with American mainstream life. By the way, the Founding Fathers actually were quite optimistic on this score. The Founding Fathers tended to be rather latitudinarian and quite capacious in their outlook on religion. And in fact, many of the leading Founding Fathers, George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, they were, if not Unitarians necessarily, they nonetheless had relatively faint dogmatic commitments. What they believed in was that, yes, religion is a very important thing, but it could be any number of kinds of religion. The important thing was to, have a sense of human imperfection, a sense of original sin, and a sense of the need to be disciplined and the need to be humble before God, however you may understand God to be. And so the Founding Fathers were quite optimistic. Interestingly enough, Edmund Burke, the Anglo-Irish statesman of the late 18th century, who's the kind of founding father, philosophically speaking, of conservatism in the English-speaking world, Edmund Burke also had even though he was a strong defender of the establishment of the Church of England within England, he was also someone who had a strong degree of support for Catholics. Edmund Burke was an Irishman, and he understood the terrible plight of Ireland's Catholics. And Edmund Burke even had a great deal of respect for Hindus within India. And in fact, when there was a visiting Hindu delegation that had come to make a case regarding the policies of the East India Company and how they felt oppressed by the East India Company, Edmund Burke, was very receptive to and very helpful for this delegation that included Hindus. And in fact, there was a Brahmin who was part of that delegation, that diplomatic delegation. The Brahmin was not able to, he was really not even able to eat because of the very strict dietary laws under which he had to conduct himself as someone of a high caste Hindu religion. And so the Brahmin needed a place where he could prepare his meals according to the very strict vegetarian dietary laws of his caste and his faith. He also needed a place in which he could perform various Hindu rituals. And so Edmund Burke actually made a place for him on his own estate of Beaconsfield. He basically said, you can have the greenhouse, you can prepare your own food there. You won't have to be interrupted. You won't have to be interfered with by anyone who is not of your caste and not of your religion. And therefore, you can actually, live according to your rights and live according to your faith in a place that I will give you on my own estate. So Edmund Burke was seen as being extremely accommodating in that regard. And it was something of a scandal, in fact, both to more traditional Christians, or at least, more dogmatic Christians in England, who thought that Burke was being far too accommodating of a non-Christian religion. But it was also a scandal to the Enlightenment types within England, who said, oh, Edmund Burke, he's accommodating, this primitive set of beliefs. He's accommodating, these superstitions. This means Burke, is not fully enlightened, just as his critics, on the more dogmatic Christian side said that Burke was, sort of betraying the Christian faith by making these accommodations for a visiting Hindu dignitary. So as I say, over time, American conservatism has changed its way of looking at the religious nature or the religious foundations, religious traditions and history of America, and has generally by turns taken a wider and wider view. As I said, the Founding Fathers themselves had a relatively capacious view. Over time, in the 19th century, especially as you have waves of immigration coming from Ireland and other places, Italy and other places, and Eastern Europe as well, you then start to have more friction and more tension between the existing Protestant majority in America and the incoming waves of immigration from Catholic Ireland, Catholic Italy, and from parts of Eastern Europe where you had large proportions of Jews. And that creates a certain amount of ethnic friction, which then kind of disrupts what the Founding Fathers had thought would be a much more harmonious mix of different religions. Well, of course, today it's the case that there are a number of prominent statesmen in America, not just in America, but throughout the Western world, including in Britain, who are of non-Christian faiths. So I think I had mentioned earlier in the podcast that in the year 2021, Britain ceased to have a Christian majority for the first time in over 1,000 years. Well, a few years later, in 2024, for the first time ever, Britain had a prime minister who was a faith that was clearly something other than Christianity. So over the centuries, England and Britain have occasionally had prime ministers who were not committed Christians, who were agnostics or even very quietly atheist. But you have never had a prime minister from a polytheistic faith or a faith explicitly other than Christianity until Rishi Sunak. So the Conservative Prime Minister in 2024, Rishi Sunak, was for the first time a Hindu Prime Minister. And yet that didn't seem to really alter the way he conducted himself as a politician. Now, his ministry was very short-lived. The Conservatives got voted out, in the 2024 election. Nevertheless, it was a kind of landmark. In America, too, you've also had a growth on the right, as well as in other, parts of the political spectrum, of leading non-Christian politicians. So Vivek Ramaswamy is currently campaigning to become the Republican nominee for governor of Ohio in the year 2026. He has a very good chance of becoming the nominee and then winning the election. And Rishi Sunak is a Hindu American. And, he doesn't see that as being anything that prevents him from being completely aligned with American conservatism. And so and he's not alone in that. You have a number of other prominent politicians or people who are very close to the Republican Party who also are Hindu. So, for example, the first American Hindu who was elected to Congress initially as a Democrat in the year 2012, is Tulsi Gabbard. And Tulsi Gabbard, of course, is now no longer in Congress. She's instead serving in Donald Trump's cabinet, and she's the first Hindu American to serve in a presidential cabinet. You also have perhaps the near future will bring maybe two new precedents in 2029 and afterwards. So if indeed Vice President J.D. Vance becomes the Republican nominee in the year 2028, and if he wins the election that year, in 2029 he will become the first Roman Catholic to serve as president in the Republican Party. Now, there have been two Roman Catholic presidents, nominally at least, who come from the Democratic Party. That's John F. Kennedy and then Joe Biden. J.D. Vance would be the first Republican Roman Catholic president. And he would have, America's very first Hindu first lady, because his wife, Usha Vance, is Hindu. So America is, changing religiously in terms of its makeup, and it's changing, also in terms of demographics. And right now on the right, there's sometimes, a kind of nostalgia or a belief that if immigration were to cease tomorrow, that America, next year would look like the America of 1980 or the America of the 1950s, which is simply not going to be the case. Now, you don't know exactly where demographic trends are going to lead. You could always have, a sudden baby boom in any kind of subset of the population. You could also have any number of religious conversions and changes. So you certainly can't take it for granted that the demographic picture of 2025 is going to continue developing, on in the 2020s and then later on in the century. However, the current trajectory is that both America and the West as a whole is going to have a much larger mix of non-Christian religions and also a larger mix of people who don't trace their ethnicity to European roots. And so the conservative movement is going to face a question of how it redefines itself, especially in terms of its religious identification, with respect to both its history and also what the future entails. So the term Judeo-Christian, for example, while it seemed very inclusive, 20 or 30 years ago, is now not going to seem inclusive enough to include various, politicians from other religions who might be conservatives and might be very prominent within the Republican Party. Already you see, of course, on the Democratic side of things, and in left-wing parties throughout Europe, you certainly see this. There is a tendency for Islam to be aligned with left-wing parties, and this may ultimately. It may ultimately actually bring a new sense of religiosity to left-wing European parties, which have been extremely secular in recent decades. So that too will be a kind of transformative effect, which may mean that there may be some virtues to that, and there may also be a number of problems. So certainly there are many things that concern Europeans about the rise, perhaps, of Islamic political power and what that might mean. Are you going to have Islamist parties? Are you going to have Islamist wings of left-wing parties? Are they going to insist on various changes to British law, especially, will free speech be impacted by, the general Islamic tendency to say that you can't criticize the Prophet Muhammad and you can't, print blasphemous pictures of Muhammad? Blasphemy laws would be a kind of shocking change. They have a history, of course, in Britain. They have a Christian history, but to have them now come from a Muslim direction, that would be quite a remarkable development in Britain, and it would be a remarkable development anywhere in Europe. So you're going to have some very, interesting political tensions and changes taking place. However, to say that these things are going to happen doesn't mean that you have to assume the worst. It also means, however, that you can't necessarily take the most optimistic view. So you have to be prepared either way for things to turn out well or badly. And you also have to think about your own principles, both not only your principles and those that, you draw upon from your religion, but also how you are going to apply those principles across religions and with people who may have very different backgrounds and who are, in fact, going to be your fellow citizens and already are your fellow citizens. Now, I want to pause for a moment and think about how one conservative intellectual, or at least one intellectual who has had a tremendous impact on conservative thinking, how one of these intellectuals thought about Western civilization. The person I want to talk about is Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss was a German Jewish immigrant from Europe. He fled the Nazis. He came to America. He stopped over in Britain on the way. He was very much an Anglophile even before the rise of the Nazis, and then became even a more strong Anglophile after the rise of the Nazis. Leo Strauss is a tremendously important intellectual historian. And as you might expect, Leo Strauss, coming from a Jewish background and also, being someone who is primarily a philosopher, someone who thinks about intellectual history rather than thinking about, he thinks more about, even though he is a great student of both Athens and Jerusalem, and he thinks very, deeply about the connection between revealed religion, which is what Jerusalem stands for, and philosophy, which is what Athens stands for. Leo Strauss himself is an intellectual historian and a philosopher, and therefore I think of him as being very much of the party of Athens, whatever his own religious denomination and background happened to be. And it was Jewish, but nonetheless, he belongs, I think, to the camp and to the party of Athens. Well, Leo Strauss thought of Western civilization in philosophical terms. And he had interesting interpretation of the very term civilization. So Leo Strauss argues that in a way, Western civilization as we know it is actually a product of the late 17th and early 18th century. And it's a product really of the British intellectual tradition. And in particular, Leo Strauss argues that starting in the 17th century with Thomas Hobbes, the great philosopher who writes, the Leviathan, who is, presenting a case for a very strong government that is then going to, that people will in fact create a strong government in order to escape a state of nature in which everyone lives in fear because everyone is capable of kind of asserting violent authority over others, and there is a threat of violent death and humiliation hanging over everyone in a natural state without a strong centralized sovereign. That's the picture that Hobbes paints in Leviathan. And Leo Strauss makes an interesting argument saying that basically the argument of Leviathan and the argument of Thomas Hobbes leads to an outlook on government in Britain. Even though most people might not identify as Hobbesians, even though most statesmen and even most subsequent philosophers in the English tradition and then later in the Anglo-American tradition don't think of themselves as Hobbesians at all. In fact, Hobbes basically creates the framework that will allow a very peaceful society to exist. It'll have a very strong government that is not necessarily, it's inspired by philosophical claims about the state of nature rather than being inspired by religious claims that may be partial and conflictual. Thomas Hobbes was certainly very much concerned about the English Civil War, which pitted Calvinists against Anglicans. Hobbes was also very conscious of the 30 Years' War on continental Europe that pitted Catholics and Protestants against one another. So Hobbes's theory in Leviathan is to create a new kind of sovereign that is not going to be dependent on one religious denomination or another, but that instead is going to be based on this sort of fear of violent death in the state of nature, and that will be overcome by creating a new state of civilization, a civil state, a civil order that will be based instead on a common lawgiver, a common sovereign, and a common enforcer of the law. This picture by Thomas Hobbes is rather dark. And, sometimes you will see thinkers claim that Thomas Hobbes is maybe a proto-liberal or a liberal himself. But Strauss is quite careful to say that Thomas Hobbes is not, in fact, a liberal, because Hobbes has a very dark view of human nature. He sees human nature as being violent. You could even say that even though Leo Strauss doesn't subscribe personally to an idea of original sin, and Thomas Hobbes, even though he was nominally at least a Christian of some kind, he seems, perhaps not to have been a believing Christian, only a nominal sort. Nevertheless, there is a sense of original sin to be found both in the philosophy of Leo Strauss and also in the philosophy of Thomas Hobbes. And so Strauss actually thinks that Hobbes is not a liberal. He's someone who, is apart from the liberal tradition. But in some ways, Thomas Hobbes is the father of the liberal tradition, because after Thomas Hobbes, you will get other philosophers such as John Locke, who take a rather more benign view of human nature and the state of nature. And they say, well, creating a state, creating a common sovereign this is something we do out of convenience. It's not something we do out of fear or because human beings are naturally violent. It's because it's simply more convenient to have a common judge rather than being a matter of life or death. Well, Leo Strauss believed that this liberal Western civilization that emerges from this historical tradition, beginning with Hobbes, being then expanded by John Locke, being then expanded upon by other philosophers and other lawyers and statesmen after Hobbes and Locke. Leo Strauss believed that this civilization was going to have a very strong liberal tendency, not necessarily that it had to be partisan liberal, not necessarily that it had to be liberal in the most extravagant ideological sense of the terms, but in general it was going to have fundamental beliefs in freedom of religion, freedom of speech, and it was also going to have something of a democratic tendency. So liberal democracy, understood in very, very broad terms, was something that Leo Strauss strongly identified with Western civilization itself. He did not think Western civilization was a vastly older thing, a thing that rooted in medieval Christendom, for example. Strauss instead thought that it was modern philosophy with a liberal tendency, in fact, that was the root of Western civilization as we know it. And you can see a case for this because obviously there is a very strong influence of John Locke on America's founding fathers. So American civilization certainly owes something to the tradition of John Locke. Also, of course, the French Revolution, even though it differs from the American Revolution in a great many ways, the French Revolution does begin with a Declaration of the Rights of Man that is drafted by the Marquis de Lafayette, who, of course, is a Frenchman who comes and fights in the American Revolution. He's one of the heroes of the American Revolution. The Marquis de Lafayette is a Frenchman who is really translating, in some ways, American political ideas, Jeffersonian political ideas, into a French idiom. And that's where the Declaration of the Rights of Man comes from. By the way, the Marquis de Lafayette, in fact, enlists an American friend to help him draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And the friend he enlists is Thomas Jefferson himself. So Jefferson is not only the author of the Declaration of Independence, he's also, in a way, the co-author of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. Now, there are differences between the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. So the French Revolution, as I say, is quite different, winds up playing out differently from the American Revolution. However, the key point I want to emphasize here, the French Revolution does indeed get a lot of impetus and inspiration, not only from the American Revolution, but behind the American Revolution, this Anglo-American tradition and this English tradition. And in fact, even before Lafayette and Jefferson, you had French intellectuals, these philosophers, who did in fact think of England as being a model for revolutionary reform in France. Now, this is, I'm describing a very Whiggish and liberal tendency in British politics and also in French politics. And it's notable that a renegade Whig, namely Edmund Burke, who I referred to earlier, becomes the philosophical father of conservatism. And Edmund Burke becomes quite a critic of John Locke, and he obviously is a very strong critic. He writes, Reflections on the Revolution in France as the first great text that is denouncing the French Revolution. So there's an interesting interplay here, historically, with the emergence of conservatism as both a negation, a criticism, a rejection of Lockeanism and also the French Revolution, but also as a kind of heir to a certain amount of the Lockean tradition, thanks to the overall influence not only of Locke, but also behind him of Thomas Hobbes within England. So this is one of the things that makes Leo Strauss very interesting to read. It's not just Strauss I'm drawing upon here, however. These really are tendencies that you will find in the texts themselves. You can certainly find that Edmund Burke, is not only an opponent of John Locke, but he also draws upon and even follows John Locke's ideas in certain other respects. And there's also, a certain, hint of Thomas Hobbes to be found in Edmund Burke as well, especially the very, sort of bloody situation, basically the revived state of nature that Edmund Burke sees arising from the French Revolution as the old regime, as the regime of Louis the XVI is toppled, and instead of having, some new British-style liberal regime created, what you actually have is simply an anarchy and a state in which the most violent forces, the Jacobins and Girondins and others, then rise to the top and start killing one another and create just enormous bloodshed. So these, questions of the role of religion and the role of philosophy in creating a civilized order have played out, over the course of British and American and indeed French history. And Western civilization as we know it, even if one doesn't want to go as far as Leo Strauss in saying that it's predicated basically on these philosophical ideas more than it is on a religious tradition going back to the Middle Ages and beyond, nevertheless, clearly these philosophical, battles have had tremendous practical implications for the kind of world in which we live. And of course, militarily, we see a vindication of the British tradition, a vindication of the American tradition as well. So Britain, of course, is the paramount power in the world in the 19th century. America is the paramount power in the so-called American century, the 20th century, and America even now is the strongest military power in the world. It is the world's leading economy. It's also very culturally powerful. It's also very politically influential as an example, certainly as an example that Europe has followed. And of course, many of Europe's states either allied with Europe, many of Europe's states either allied with the United States in World War II, or they were enemies of the United States in World War II, in which case they were defeated and reconstructed. So Germany now shows a great deal of influence of American ideas as well as British ideas. And for that matter, the same can be said about Japan and to some extent Italy as well. So there has been a sort of political military vindication of Western civilization as Leo Strauss understood it, as being rooted in Anglo-American ideas and Anglo-American then subsequent power as well. In the 21st century, some of this might be shifting a little bit. You see, the rise of economic power in centers outside of Europe and centers outside of America. This is still an ongoing process, so it's not yet the case that even China is necessarily, on par with the United States, although it's getting there. India is also rising very quickly. So you're going to see perhaps a shift of power, even as you also see a shift of power globally, even as you see a change in religion and in demographics in the West itself. Again, this is going to put to the test some of the questions that conservatives have had to ask themselves over generations about what our civilization is based on, what our political principles are based on. Are they necessarily anchored in one particular religion? Are they more philosophical and universal? Or are they some sort of, practical blend? Do we just muddle through and succeed in these ways? So I mention all of this not because I want to offer a pat solution or an easy answer, but rather because I do think it's appropriate for conservatives now to think very seriously about these questions and to try to examine the different hypotheses and the different scenarios, both optimistic and pessimistic, and perhaps also somewhere in the middle, of where different policies and simply different trajectories in Western civilization and in the world are going to lead us. It really is going to be in some ways not necessarily a fully post-Western century in the later 21st century, but I think we can expect it to be a somewhat post-Western century. And therefore, we have to think, what does it mean to have a civilization, to have Western ideals, Western politics, and some degree of Western power and wealth in a world that may increasingly be non-Western in terms of its religion, in terms of where in the world you have sort of wealth accumulating and the most trade and so forth. These are critical questions that conservatives, have to ask themselves, and they have to ask themselves very critically. There's a lot of wishful thinking on the American right, again, which tends to say, hey, if we just, cut off immigration tomorrow, if we just, strengthen NATO, if we just do a few things similarly to what we had done in the 1980s, or perhaps, a few decades before that, then we're simply going to turn back the clock and have the world and have the America and have the Europe that had existed in the mid-20th century or earlier. And that's not the case. We really are dealing with a very new world, and so we have to ask ourselves which old ideas and which old, elements of our civilization are going to be able to make the world a healthy place, a good place for us, which ones are going to make the world more dangerous and make our own countries perhaps less stable.